The Psychology of Silent Hill, How Team Silent Created Gaming's Most Sophisticated Horror. Silent Hill stands as video gaming's most psychologically sophisticated horror franchise, transforming abstract theories from Freud, Jung, and clinical psychology into interactive nightmares that reveal profound truths about the human psyche. Team Silent's masterwork represents an unprecedented fusion of academic psychology with interactive storytelling, creating experiences that function simultaneously as entertainment and psychological education. The series' genius lies in externalizing internal psychological states through supernatural manifestation. Rather than simply depicting mental illness, Silent Hill creates worlds where unconscious conflicts, repressed memories, and traumatic experiences become tangible, interactive realities. This approach allows players to literally navigate through psychological landscapes, confronting fears and traumas in ways impossible through traditional media. Freudian foundations. The unconscious made manifest. Team Silent drew extensively from Freudian psychoanalysis, particularly concepts of the unconscious mind, repression, and the tripartite structure of personality. Silent Hill 2's James Sunderland represents the most sophisticated implementation of Freudian theory in gaming history. James's journey through Silent Hill functions as what Freud termed a punishment dream, an unconscious fantasy where the ego seeks punishment for repressed guilt. His psychological structure perfectly demonstrates his superego manifests overwhelming guilt externalized through Pyramid Head's relentless punishment, while his ego attempts to rationalize this journey as a quest for reunion rather than atonement. The game's defense mechanisms operate with clinical precision. James exhibits repression by burying memories of Mary's murder, projection by externalizing guilt onto monsters, displacement by redirecting emotions toward Silent Hill's creatures, and denial through constructing false narratives about Mary's death timeline. These aren't merely story elements. They're interactive demonstrations of how the human psyche protects itself from unbearable truth. Freudian psychosexual symbolism permeates the series. Pyramid Head's great knife represents phallic aggression and sexual frustration, while his assault on mannequins externalizes James's repressed libidinal tensions during Mary's illness. The hospital environment symbolized sterile, medicalized sexuality, reflecting James's complex feelings about Mary's deteriorating body and his own frustrated desires. The Oedipus complex appears most clearly in Walter Sullivan's pathology from Silent Hill 4, where Room 302 literally becomes his mother, an extreme manifestation of childhood fixation that drives his ritualistic behavior. Even Silent Hill 1 explores father-daughter dynamics through Harry's protective relationship with Cheryl, threatened by corrupting mother figures representing the dangerous feminine. Death drive and repetition compulsion. Freud's later theoretical developments find sophisticated expression throughout Silent Hill. The death drive, Thanatos, manifests in characters' unconscious attraction to destruction and suffering. James repeatedly returns to locations associated with Mary's death, demonstrating repetition compulsion, the unconscious need to recreate traumatic experiences. His multiple visits to the hospital where Mary died represent this compulsive repetition, each return bringing him closer to conscious acknowledgement of his actions. The pleasure principle versus reality principle conflict drives much of Silent Hill 2's narrative tension. James's fantasy of Mary calling to him represents the pleasure principle, the ego's desire for immediate gratification and wish fulfillment. However, reality principle demands gradually emerge through increasingly undeniable evidence of his guilt. forcing confrontation with actual rather than desired circumstances. Freudian slips appear throughout character dialogue, revealing unconscious knowledge that contradicts conscious beliefs. James's verbal hesitations, contradictory statements about timeline, and moments of unexpected honesty demonstrate how the unconscious mind betrays conscious deception. These linguistic markers provide players with psychological clues about characters' true mental states. Jungian psychology, shadow work, and archetypal horror. Carl Jung's analytical psychology provides Silent Hill's second major theoretical framework. Pyramid Head exemplifies Jung's shadow archetype, representing James's rejected, unconscious aspects that he refuses to acknowledge. This isn't simply a monster, it's a therapeutic agent forcing integration of denied psychological material. The series demonstrates Jung's individuation process through character arcs. James progresses from persona breakdown through shadow encounter to anima integration before achieving potential self-realization in the game's multiple endings. His false identity as grieving widower crumbles as he confronts Pyramid Head and his guilt, ultimately reconciling Mary and Maria aspects of his psyche. Archetypal characters populate Silent Hill's landscape. The mother archetype appears as both nurturing and devouring, from Silent Hill 1's maternal horror to Silent Hill 3's forced pregnancy themes. Nurses represent the corrupted caregiver archetype, transforming healing into threat. The child archetype manifests in various forms, from gray children representing lost innocence to Heather's struggle with inherited trauma. Jung's collective unconscious explains Silent Hill's universal resonance. The town draws from archetypal imagery that transcends cultural boundaries. Water representing the unconscious through Toluca Lake, fire as purification and destruction, mirrors reflecting hidden truths, and hospitals as sites of healing and trauma. These symbols speak directly to the human psyche regardless of personal experience. The anima-animus concept appears most clearly in James's relationship with Mary versus Maria. Mary represents his idealized anima, the domesticated feminine aspect, while Maria embodies the raw, unrestrained version reflecting unconscious desires. His final confrontation requires integrating these aspects rather than choosing between them. Synchronicity and meaningful coincidence. Jung's concept of synchronicity, meaningful coincidence rather than causality, explains many of Silent Hill's supernatural elements. Characters arrive in Silent Hill during psychological crisis moments, suggesting that external events align with internal psychological states rather than operating through normal cause and effect relationships. The town calls to people when they need to confront specific psychological material, representing synchronistic rather than logical attraction. This principle extends to monster encounters and environmental changes. Locations shift between normal and nightmarish states based on characters' psychological readiness to confront specific traumas. The timing of these transformations suggests meaningful coincidence rather than random supernatural activity, creating a world where psychological necessity drives supernatural manifestation. Modern trauma theory, PTSD, and complex trauma. Beyond classical psychoanalysis, Silent Hill incorporates contemporary understanding of trauma psychology. The series demonstrates sophisticated awareness of post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms and complex trauma effects, particularly in characters like Angela Orozco and Walter Sullivan. Angela's presentation in Silent Hill 2 accurately depicts complex PTSD from childhood sexual abuse. Her dissociative episodes, emotional numbing, hypervigilance around authority figures, and suicidal ideation represent textbook complex trauma symptoms. Her perception of Silent Hill as constantly burning reflects how trauma survivors experience the world as perpetually dangerous, with normal environments feeling threatening due to conditioned fear responses. Complex trauma's impact on identity formation appears throughout Walter Sullivan's pathology. His inability to form stable sense of self, resulting in identification with inanimate objects, room 302, demonstrates how severe childhood trauma disrupts normal identity development. His dissociative episodes create multiple self-states representing different trauma responses. Child Walter preserving hope, adult Walter expressing rage, and crucified Walter embodying victimization. Intergenerational trauma transmission. Silent Hill 3 explores how trauma passes between generations through Heather's inheritance of Alessa's experiences. This reflects contemporary research on epigenetic trauma transmission, how traumatic experiences can affect gene expression and be passed to offspring. Heather experiences nightmares, phobias, and emotional responses connected to events she never personally experienced, demonstrating how family trauma histories can impact subsequent generations. The series also examines cultural trauma through the Order's multi-generational abuse patterns. Each generation repeats traumatic behaviors learned from previous ones, creating cycles of institutional abuse that persist across decades. This reflects research on how communities can perpetuate trauma through cultural practices and belief systems. Silent Hill 2, James Sunderland's Psychological Hell. Silent Hill 2's monster catalog reads like a psychiatric textbook brought to life, each creature representing specific psychological conflicts within James's traumatized psyche. The lying figures embody multiple layers of symbolism, wrapped in skin-tight restraints like body bags. They represent Mary's corpse-like state during illness. Their constant writhing mirrors both Mary's suffering and James's feeling of being trapped in their deteriorating marriage. The acid spray they emit from chest cavities represents destructive emotions, perhaps James's suppressed anger or his own sexual frustration manifesting as toxic, harmful discharge. The bubblehead nurses transform the caring feminine archetype into something sexualized and threatening. Their provocative attire, low-cut blouses, short skirts, and high stockings, represents James's frustrated libido during Mary's illness. The bubble-like head coverings obscure their faces, making them simultaneously alluring and faceless, reflecting how James's sexual needs became disconnected from genuine intimacy. Their twitching movements suggest the anxiety surrounding his repressed desires, while their steel pipe weapons turn nurturing into violence. Mannequins present perhaps the most disturbing representation of objectified femininity. Built from two pairs of legs with no upper torso, they're literally incomplete women, sexual objects without identity, personality, or humanity. They attack by kicking, using the very parts of the female body they represent as weapons. Their stillness until discovered by light forces James to literally illuminate his own psychological problems before they become aggressive. The abstract daddy, though primarily representing Angela's trauma, reflects James' projection of sexual violence and guilt. Two bodies trapped in sexual position under a blanket of skin, unable to separate, represent the violation of intimacy and the corruption of sexual connection through abuse. James sees this monster because his own actions toward Mary, killing her during her vulnerable illness, contain elements of violation that resonate with Angela's experiences. Pyramid Head serves as James's ultimate psychological executioner. His triangular helmet was inspired by the executioner painting in the Historical Society, but psychologically represents James's need for punishment. The great knife he drags symbolizes the weight of guilt James carries, too heavy to lift easily, creating that distinctive scraping sound that announces judgment's approach. Pyramid Head's assault on other monsters, particularly mannequins, forces James to witness his own psychological violence externalized. The final boss battle against Mary/Maria in the hotel represents James's ultimate confrontation with anima integration. The creature suspended in a metal frame reflects both Mary's medical apparatus during illness and Maria's artificial construction as a fantasy replacement. Her pleas to James during the fight, "James, why are you being so cruel?" force him to confront the cruelty of both his actions toward Mary and his psychological replacement of her with Maria. The Hotel and Memory Palace Technique. The Lakeview Hotel functions as James's memory palace, a psychological technique where memories are organized spatially. Each room contains specific memories and emotional associations from James and Mary's relationship. The honeymoon suite represents their romantic beginning, while the basement areas symbolize the darker aspects of their marriage that James buried in his unconscious. The hotel's videotape reveals represent recovered memories emerging through environmental triggers. As James progresses through familiar spaces, suppressed memories surface naturally, demonstrating how location-based cues can unlock traumatic memories. This reflects actual therapeutic techniques used in trauma treatment, where returning to safe versions of trauma sites can facilitate memory integration. Silent Hill 3, Heather's feminine horror and inherited trauma. Silent Hill, 3 shifts focus to specifically feminine psychological fears, exploring themes of unwanted pregnancy, sexual violence, and identity formation through Heather's journey as Alessa's reincarnation. The game's monster design reflects distinctly gendered anxieties about bodily autonomy and sexual threat. The closer appears early in Heather's journey, encountered feeding on a corpse in a clothing store. With enlarged club-like arms and a skirt-like lower body, it represents overwhelming physical threat in spaces where women should feel safe, shopping areas and fashion stores. Its lipless mouth stretched across its face suggests sexual threat without the possibility of communication or negotiation. The closer embodies the fear of being overpowered by masculine aggression in supposedly safe feminine spaces. Double-head creatures combine canine aggression with symbolic splitting. Their heads open along the middle like opening jaws, but also like wounds or sexual openings. They represent the duality of Heather's identity as both herself and Alessa, but also the splitting of female identity under pressure from external forces trying to control her destiny. The pendulum monsters floating through Lakeside Amusement Park with blade-like legs represent the constant threat of violence hanging over feminine existence. They're unpredictable in their attacks, swooping down without warning, embodying the anxiety that violence can strike women at any moment, even in spaces associated with childhood joy and innocence. Slurpers hide under furniture and attack from below, representing threats that remain hidden until women are in vulnerable positions. Their name suggests sexual predation, while their small size and hiding behavior reflect how sexual threat often comes from unexpected sources or familiar environments. The missionary boss encounter forces Heather to confront organized religious masculinity, armed with blade weapons. Its name references religious conversion, reflecting how the order seeks to convert Heather to their purposes regardless of her consent. The The creature's aggressive, unpredictable movements between calm poses and violent lunges mirror how patriarchal religious authority can shift suddenly from benevolent to threatening. Valtiel presents a unique challenge to interpretation, described as God's attendant rather than a manifestation of Heather's psyche. He appears throughout the game, performing mysterious maintenance tasks. His positioning behind Heather as she climbs ladders, where he could view up her skirt, represents the constant surveillance and sexualization women experience, even from supposedly protective or neutral sources. The birth symbolism culminates in Heather's forced pregnancy with God. When she vomits up the fetus after taking the drug from Leonard, she literally rejects the attempt to use her body for others' purposes. The final boss battle against the prematurely born God, malformed and incomplete, represents triumph over forces that would define her existence solely through her reproductive capacity. Adolescent identity formation under trauma. Heather's character arc demonstrates how inherited trauma affects adolescent development. Her transition from carefree teenager to hardened survivor reflects accelerated maturation under stress, a common response to trauma exposure during critical developmental periods. Her increasing confidence and aggression throughout the game represent healthy adaptation, contrasting with Alessa's earlier helplessness. The shopping mall setting reflects adolescent identity exploration through consumer culture, but the corruption of these spaces demonstrates how trauma disrupts normal developmental processes. Heather's relationship with material objects becomes complicated by supernatural threats, representing how trauma survivors may struggle with normal adolescent concerns about appearance and belonging. Silent Hill 4, Walter Sullivan's fractured psyche and maternal obsession. Silent Hill 4 presents psychology's most complex exploration of severe attachment disorder and dissociative identity formation. Walter Sullivan's condition stems from abandonment trauma so severe it created a complete break from reality, manifesting as the belief that room 302 is literally his mother. Walter's psychological splitting appears throughout the game in multiple forms. The innocent child Walter who knocks on doors seeking his mother represents his preserved childhood need for maternal attachment, while adult Walter embodies the murderous rage born from that need's frustration. This dissociation isn't metaphorical. Walter's psyche literally divided itself during the trauma of abandonment, creating separate selves that can interact with each other. The 21 Sacraments ritual reflects Walter's attempt to reunite with his mother through an elaborate delusion system. Each murder is numbered and ritualistic, representing his belief that sufficient sacrifice will awaken room 302's maternal response. This delusional thinking demonstrates how severe childhood trauma can create alternative reality systems that feel more truthful than actual experience. Room 302's transformation throughout the game mirrors psychological deterioration under extreme stress. As Walter's influence grows stronger, the apartment develops hauntings, supernatural manifestations that represent traumatic memories bleeding into present reality. The holes appearing in walls symbolize psychological boundaries breaking down, allowing past trauma to contaminate current experience. The monsters Walter creates reflect his distorted worldview and traumatic experiences. Sniffer dogs embody his fear and hatred of the animals, stemming from childhood abuse at the pet shop where he worked. Their umbilical-like tongues that drain blood represent his deep need for maternal nourishment combined with his experience of being drained by uncaring institutional systems. Twin victims appear as conjoined infants on adult legs, representing Walter's arrested development. psychologically remaining an infant despite adult capabilities. Their crying and helpless gestures reflect his core emotional state, while their doubled nature represents his psychological splitting. Wall men emerge from solid surfaces to grab at Henry, representing Walter's feeling that threats could emerge from anywhere in his childhood environment. Their positioning within walls suggests how institutional abuse made even basic shelter feel dangerous and unpredictable. The ghosts of Walter's victims represent how unresolved trauma continues to haunt both perpetrator and survivors. These spirits can only be permanently stopped by the sword of obedience, symbolizing how traumatic cycles require deliberate intervention and pinning down, rather than simply avoiding or fighting. Walter's identification with Christ through his crucifixion represents the ultimate expression of his Messiah complex. By dying and resurrecting himself to complete the ritual, he positions himself as Savior while simultaneously being victim, a psychological position common in severe abuse survivors who develop grandiose delusions to cope with powerlessness. Urban isolation and modern attachment disorders. Silent Hill 4's apartment setting reflects contemporary urban isolation and its psychological effects. Henry Townshend's initial situation, trapped in his apartment, unable to form meaningful connections with neighbors, represents modern urban alienation that creates vulnerability to supernatural intrusion. The apartment complex becomes a metaphor for social disconnection in modern cities where people live in close physical proximity while remaining emotionally isolated. Walter's choice of apartment victims reflects his targeting of the most isolated individuals, those whose disappearance might go unnoticed. This demonstrates predatory recognition of social vulnerability, while also reflecting Walter's own profound loneliness projected onto others. His attacks on couples represent rage against the maternal bonding he never experienced. Environmental storytelling, psychology made spatial. Silent Hill's environments function as externalized psychological states, transforming abstract mental concepts into navigable spaces. This environmental psychology operates on multiple symbolic levels simultaneously. Hospitals represent medical trauma and loss of autonomy. Brookhaven Hospital's shift from healing space to organic nightmare reflects how medical environments can become sites of trauma rather than recovery. The iconic nurses embody this contradiction, caregivers transformed into threats, representing anxieties about healthcare corruption and loss of control during illness. The hospital's endless corridors and locked doors mirror the feeling of being trapped within medical systems, while the rust and decay suggest how illness corrupts the body's normal functioning. Schools symbolize childhood development disrupted by trauma. Midwich Elementary reflects Alessa's experience of bullying and social ostracism, while the gray children represent lost innocence and long-term impact of childhood abuse. The juxtaposition of normal classroom elements with grotesque transformations demonstrates how trauma corrupts developmental environments. Empty playgrounds and silent hallways suggest childhood joy permanently stolen, while locked doors and maze-like layouts represent how trauma blocks normal developmental progression. Apartments in Silent Hill 2 represent domestic dysfunction and marital breakdown. Woodside and Blue Creek Apartments' deteriorating conditions mirror the decay of James and Mary's relationship during her illness. The multiple locked doors suggest emotional barriers between spouses, while the holes James must crawl through represent desperate attempts to maintain connection despite breakdown. The apartment's shift from normal to nightmarish parallels how illness transformed James's home from haven to prison. Prisons symbolize guilt and self-punishment. Toluca Prison's existence beneath the historical society suggests how past trauma lies buried under official narratives. The gallows in the courtyard represent James's unconscious desire for punishment, while the prison cells mirror his feeling of being trapped by guilt. The invisible prisoners whose voices James hears represent suppressed acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Room 302 in Silent Hill 4 represents the maternal womb and safe space corrupted. Its gradual transformation from comfortable apartment to haunted nightmare mirrors how trauma corrupts our most basic need for safety and nurturing. The holes appearing in walls represent psychological boundaries breaking down, while the hauntings represent how past trauma intrudes on present attempts at stability. Liminal spaces and psychological transition. Silent Hill excels at creating liminal spaces, threshold areas between normal and supernatural states that mirror psychological transition periods. The fog-shrouded streets represent the boundary between conscious and unconscious awareness, while the shift between normal and otherworld versions of location symbolizes the transition between psychological states. Elevators function as particularly potent liminal symbols, representing movement between psychological levels. The descent into basement areas consistently represents journey into unconscious material, while ascension often coincides with moments of psychological revelation or escape from traumatic material. The mechanical sounds and confined spaces of elevators create anxiety that mirrors the discomfort of psychological transition. Doorways and thresholds require active choice from characters, representing psychological commitment to confronting difficult material. Locked doors that later open suggest psychological readiness developing over time, while doors that remain locked represent psychological material the character isn't ready to confront. Sound design and psychological manipulation. Akira Yamaoka's sound design creates psychological atmosphere that operates below conscious awareness, using frequency manipulation and psychoacoustic principles to generate anxiety and unease. The famous radio static doesn't just signal monster presence, it represents the interference between conscious and unconscious awareness, the psychological static that occurs when repressed material approaches consciousness. Industrial sounds throughout the series reflect modern alienation and mechanical dehumanization. The constant background hum of machinery represents the psychological pressure of modern life, while the grinding and scraping sounds mirror internal emotional friction. The contrast between mechanical noise and organic sounds highlights the series' exploration of human versus inhuman elements. Musical dissonance creates emotional discomfort that mirrors psychological dissonance, the anxiety that occurs when belief systems conflict with reality. The series uses a tonal composition and unexpected harmonic progressions to generate unease that reflects characters' internal emotional states. Silence becomes as important as sound, creating space for players to project their own anxieties. The series uses strategic silence to force attention to environmental details and internal psychological state, demonstrating how absence of stimulus can be more anxiety-provoking than presence of threat. The Order, institutional abuse and religious trauma. Across all games, the Order represents how religious and institutional authority can perpetuate cycles of abuse while claiming moral superiority. Their consistent involvement in child abuse reflects how power structures can corrupt caregiving relationships and create environments where trauma flourishes. Alessa's burning in the original game represents extreme religious abuse, literally sacrificing a child for adult spiritual goals. Her mother Dahlia's participation shows how religious fanaticism can override natural protective instincts, creating a system where children exist solely to serve adult religious needs. Silent Hill 3's pregnancy themes explore how religious authority seeks to control female bodies and reproductive choices. Claudia's attempt to force Heather to bear God represents religious systems that view women primarily as vessels for divine purpose rather than autonomous individuals with their own rights and desires. Walter Sullivan's institutional abuse reveals systematic child maltreatment within religious orphanages. The Water Prison, a secret facility where children were tortured for failing to meet behavioral standards, represents how religious institutions can use their moral authority to justify extreme cruelty. Walter's resulting psychological pathology demonstrates how religious trauma can create dissociative conditions and delusional thinking. The Hope House orphanage connection across multiple games suggests institutional abuse was systematic rather than isolated. The Order's consistent targeting of children for spiritual purposes reflects how religious organizations can become predatory institutions that consume the vulnerable while claiming divine mandate. Cult psychology and thought control. The Order demonstrates sophisticated understanding of cult psychology and mind control techniques. Their use of social isolation, information control, and punishment systems reflects real cult indoctrination methods. Members undergo progressive commitment escalation, starting with minor ritual participation and gradually increasing involvement until escape becomes psychologically impossible. The cult's promise of spiritual transformation through suffering mirrors how abusive religious systems justify present pain through promised future reward. This delayed gratification system creates psychological dependency while legitimizing current abuse as necessary for spiritual growth. Character psychological profiles, trauma personified, Harry Mason, external trauma, and parental resilience. Harry stands apart as Silent Hill's most psychologically stable protagonist. His journey represents vicarious trauma, psychological damage from witnessing others' suffering rather than personal guilt. Unlike other protagonists, Harry's monsters originate from Alessa's traumatized consciousness, making him a victim of external psychological manifestation. His core psychological conflicts center on profound grief from losing his wife Jody and desperate fear of losing Cheryl. His remarkable resilience demonstrates protective factors, strong parental bonds, clear moral compass, and rational problem-solving abilities that enable survival despite overwhelming supernatural stress. Harry's ability to maintain reality testing while surrounded by others' psychological projections shows remarkable psychological strength and suggests healthy attachment patterns that protect against dissociation. Harry's character demonstrates how secure attachment relationships can provide psychological protection during extreme stress. His consistent focus on protecting Cheryl, even when confronted with evidence of her supernatural nature, shows how parental love can transcend rational understanding and provide motivation for survival. James Sunderland, guilt and sexual frustration manifested. James represents gaming's most sophisticated psychological character study. His monster manifestations directly correspond to specific psychological conflicts. Lying figures represent Mary's bedridden state and James's feeling trapped in marriage. Their body bag appearance symbolizes death, while their acid spray represents toxic emotions and sexual frustration. Bubblehead nurses embody frustrated libido through sexualized yet threatening appearance. Their medical context ties to Mary's illness, while their faceless heads represent disconnection between sexual desire and emotional intimacy. Mannequins, pure objectification of femininity. Incomplete women existing only as sexual objects without identity or agency. Abstract daddy, though originating from Angela's trauma, reflects James's projection of sexual violence, guilt, and the corruption of intimacy through violation. Final boss, Mary Char Maria, forces integration of anima aspects for psychological resolution, requiring James to acknowledge both his genuine love and his replacement fantasy. His psychological journey demonstrates cathartic method, Jung's concept of healing through reliving traumatic experiences. As the game progresses, James fully confesses his actions and potentially achieves self-forgiveness, representing successful therapeutic process. Heather Morris, identity crisis and inherited trauma. Heather embodies adolescent identity formation complicated by supernatural circumstances. Her psychology reflects generational trauma, inheriting Alessa's experiences while maintaining her own personality development. Her religious trauma manifests through anti-religious sentiment and fear of spiritual authority figures. Her coming-of-age journey transforms her from carefree teenager to hardened survivor. Monster encounters become less threatening as she grows psychologically stronger, representing mastery over inherited trauma. Her final rejection of the cult's predetermined destiny demonstrates agency reclamation, choosing personal identity over imposed roles. Heather's anger and defiance serve as psychological protection against attempts to control her destiny. Her sharp tongue and aggressive responses represent healthy resistance to manipulation, contrasting with Alessa's earlier victimization. This transformation shows how inherited trauma can become empowerment when channeled through personal agency. Angela Orozco, childhood sexual abuse survivor. Angela represents one of gaming's most accurate portrayals of childhood sexual abuse trauma. Her presentation demonstrates complex PTSD symptoms, including emotional numbing, hypervigilance, dissociation, and suicidal ideation. Her perception of Silent Hill as constantly burning reflects how trauma survivors experience the world as perpetually dangerous. Her interactions with James reveal her difficulty trusting male figures due to abuse history. Her defensive postures, flinching responses, and assumption of harmful intent demonstrate learned survival behaviors that persist even in non-threatening situations. Her tragic ending reflects the reality that not all trauma survivors achieve healing, particularly those without adequate support systems. Angela's knife discovery scene demonstrates how trauma survivors may be drawn to self-destructive behaviors while simultaneously seeking rescue. Her offer of the knife to James represents both suicidal ideation and a test of his intentions, showing the complex psychological calculations trauma survivors make in interpersonal situations. Walter Sullivan, attachment disorder and dissociative pathology. Walter represents contemporary psychological isolation in urban environments combined with severe childhood trauma. His attachment disorder manifests as inability to form normal human relationships, leading to his identification of Room 302 as his mother figure. This represents extreme pathological object attachment stemming from maternal deprivation. His dissociative identity formation creates multiple Walter selves, innocent child, murderous adult, and crucified corpse, representing different aspects of his trauma response. The child Walter preserves his original need for maternal love, while adult Walter embodies his rage and vengeance against a world that abandoned him. His 21 Sacraments ritual demonstrates delusional thinking common in severe trauma survivors. The elaborate belief system he creates allows him to maintain hope of reunion with his mother while justifying extreme violence. This represents how childhood abandonment trauma can create alternative reality systems that feel more truthful than actual experience. Walter's inability to distinguish between metaphor and reality shows how severe dissociation affects cognitive processing. His literal belief that room 302 is his mother, rather than understanding it as symbolic representation of maternal absence, demonstrates concrete thinking common in severely traumatized individuals. Team Silent's development philosophy and influences. Team Silent drew from diverse psychological and cultural sources to create their sophisticated horror framework. Director Keiichiro Toyama described the game world as resembling someone else's dreams and reconstruction of fragments of memory, explicitly positioning Silent Hill as dream psychology made interactive. The team consulted legitimate psychological texts incorporating Freudian psychoanalysis, Jungian analytical psychology, and contemporary trauma theory. Literary influences included Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment for guilt and redemption themes, while cinematic influences drew from David Lynch's surrealist filmmaking and Jacob's Ladder's psychological horror techniques. Cultural sensitivity appeared in Team Silent's integration of Japanese psychological approaches alongside Western frameworks. This synthesis created unique perspective on mental health that transcended single cultural viewpoints, contributing to the series' international resonance. The incorporation of Japanese concepts like mono no aware, impermanence, and wabi-sabi, beauty in imperfection, provided alternative frameworks for understanding trauma and healing. The developers explicitly aimed to create nostalgic streets that trigger deja vu, normal people, and strange ugly monsters, demonstrating understanding that effective psychological horror emerges from familiar elements corrupted rather than purely alien threats. This approach reflects psychological research showing that uncanny valley effects, familiar things made slightly wrong, create more lasting fear than completely foreign threats. Japanese versus Western psychological approaches. The series demonstrates sophisticated integration of Eastern and Western psychological traditions. Japanese concepts of group harmony versus individual expression create tension reflected in characters' struggles between personal desires and social expectations. The notion of reading the air, understanding unspoken social dynamics, appears in characters' ability to sense supernatural presence and hidden psychological material. Mono no aware, the pathos of things, infuses the series with melancholic acceptance of impermanence. This Buddhist-influenced concept explains the series' focus on loss, decay, and the temporary nature of all relationships and achievements. Characters must accept rather than fight against change, finding meaning within impermanence rather than seeking permanent solutions. Mental health themes, clinical accuracy, and complexity. Silent Hill's portrayal of mental illness demonstrates remarkable clinical sophistication while occasionally perpetuating harmful stereotypes. The series accurately depicts PTSD symptoms, including memory suppression, guilt manifestation, nightmares, social withdrawal, and avoidance behaviors. James exhibits textbook complicated grief, showing how trauma disrupts normal mourning processes. Dissociative identity disorder receives complex treatment, particularly in Walter Sullivan's multiple self states and Travis Grady's potential dissociative manifestation in Origins. However, The portrayal sometimes oversimplifies the condition as simple good-bad personality splits, lacking the nuanced coping mechanisms that characterize real dissociative experiences. The series excels in depicting childhood trauma's long-term effects, Heather's religious trauma from inherited Alessa memories, Angela's suicidal depression from sexual abuse, and Walter's attachment disorders from maternal deprivation all reflect legitimate clinical presentations. The games show how early trauma creates lasting psychological vulnerabilities that manifest in adulthood through specific trigger situations. Memory repression receives controversial treatment reflecting real academic debates. James's suppressed memories of killing Mary engage with the memory wars in psychology, the contentious question of whether traumatic memories can be completely repressed and later recovered. Silent Hill, Shattered Memories, explicitly explores false memory construction, showing how therapeutic suggestion might create inaccurate recollections. The series demonstrates impressive cultural competency in mental health approaches. Silent Hill 4 reflects Japanese Morita therapy principles, emphasizing present moment awareness over past exploration, contrasting with Western psychodynamic approaches that dominate other entries. This cultural sensitivity extends to varying stigma levels and treatment philosophies across different societies. Therapeutic implications and cathartic gaming. Silent Hill's psychological sophistication suggests potential therapeutic applications beyond entertainment. The series demonstrates how interactive media can foster empathy for mental illness sufferers by allowing players to experience psychological distress from the inside. This experiential learning differs qualitatively from educational approaches that rely on external observation or description. The cathartic aspects of Silent Hill gameplay mirror therapeutic processes used in trauma treatment. Players confront fears in controlled environments, gradually building tolerance for anxiety-provoking material. The progression from helplessness to mastery reflects exposure therapy principles, while the symbolic representation of psychological conflicts enables processing of difficult material through metaphorical distance. However, the horror context raises ethical questions about using mental illness as entertainment. The series' association of psychological disturbance with supernatural threat may reinforce stigma and fear around mental health conditions. Contemporary game design increasingly addresses these concerns through consultation with mental health professionals and more nuanced portrayals, academic recognition, and scholarly analysis. Silent Hill has generated substantial scholarly attention from psychology journals, game studies publications, and academic institutions. The franchise has been analyzed through psychoanalytic frameworks, examining game space construction and memory representation within clinical contexts. University publications have provided comprehensive academic analysis, situating Silent Hill within survival horror genre history and examining narrative structure, imagery, sound, and game mechanics through scholarly lens. Clinical psychology perspectives provide detailed analysis of character psychology using established therapeutic frameworks, consistently recognizing Silent Hill's clinical insights while noting areas where mental illness portrayal could be more responsible. The series has been used in university coursework, examining video game psychology, horror genre analysis, and interactive media's educational potential. This academic recognition validates Silent Hill's sophisticated integration of psychological theory with interactive design. Silent Hill, Shattered Memories introduced revolutionary psychological profiling through real-time assessment affecting gameplay. Dr. Kaufman's therapy sessions represent the most realistic, therapeutic portrayal in gaming, developed through consultation with actual psychiatrists. The game's psych profile system makes psychological assessment central to gameplay mechanics, rather than peripheral narrative element. Research applications and clinical studies. Contemporary research explores Silent Hill's potential applications in psychology education and therapy training. The series' accurate portrayal of psychological symptoms provides educational value for students learning to recognize clinical presentations. The interactive nature allows experiential learning about trauma effects that traditional textbook study cannot provide. Some therapeutic applications explore using Silent Hill's symbolic framework in art therapy and narrative therapy approaches. The series' rich symbolic language provides vocabulary for discussing difficult psychological material, while the progression through psychological landscapes mirrors therapeutic journey metaphors used in clinical practice. Research into horror gaming's psychological effects uses Silent Hill as a primary case study. Studies examine how controlled exposure to psychological horror affects empathy development, anxiety tolerance, and understanding of mental health conditions. These investigations contribute to broader understanding of interactive media's psychological impact. Silent Hill versus other horror games, depth beyond jump scares. Silent Hill's psychological sophistication becomes most apparent when compared to other horror gaming franchises. While most horror games rely on external threats and startle responses, Silent Hill creates fear through internal psychological recognition. The terror of seeing one's own hidden thoughts made manifest. Resident Evil, external versus internal horror. Resident Evil represents horror gaming's most successful mainstream franchise, but its psychological approach differs fundamentally from Silent Hill's internalized trauma focus. Resident Evil's zombies and bioorganic weapons represent external threats that can be defeated through superior firepower and resource management. The horror emerges from feeling overpowered by external forces rather than confronting internal psychological conflicts. The T-virus outbreak creates chaos through external contamination rather than psychological breakdown. Players fear running out of ammunition or being overwhelmed by numbers, creating resource management anxiety rather than existential dread. While effective at generating immediate stress responses, this approach lacks Silent Hill's psychological depth and personal relevance. Resident Evil's protagonists, Leon Kennedy, Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, remain psychologically stable throughout their ordeals. They may experience stress responses, but their core identities remain intact. They don't question their perceptions, confront repressed memories, or undergo fundamental personality changes. The horror remains external to their psychological structure. However, Resident Evil 7 and Village attempted deeper psychological elements, exploring family trauma and parental anxiety through Ethan Winter's experiences. These entries showed the franchise recognizing Silent Hill's influence, incorporating psychological themes alongside traditional action horror elements. Fatal Frame, spiritual versus psychological horror. Fatal Frame creates atmospheric horror through supernatural photography mechanics and Japanese folklore, but its psychological elements remain surface level compared to Silent Hill's clinical depth. The series explores themes of death, loss, and spiritual attachment, but primarily through external supernatural forces, rather than internal psychological manifestation. Fatal Frames protagonists encounter ghosts representing tragic historical events rather than personal psychological material. While emotionally affecting, these encounters don't force self-examination or psychological growth in the way Silent Hill's monster confrontations demand personal recognition and integration. The camera mechanic creates unique tension by requiring players to face threats directly rather than avoiding them. But this represents mechanical innovation rather than psychological sophistication. The horror emerges from supernatural encounter rather than psychological revelation. Amnesia, atmospheric horror without personal stakes. Amnesia, the dark descent creates exceptional atmospheric horror through environmental storytelling and vulnerability mechanics, but lacks Silent Hill's personal psychological investment. Daniel's amnesia creates mystery and dread, but the revealed truth serves plot resolution rather than psychological integration. The sanity mechanics simulate psychological breakdown effects without exploring underlying psychological causes. Players experience symptoms of mental distress, visual distortions, auditory hallucinations, disorientation, but these remain gameplay mechanics rather than meaningful psychological exploration. Amnesia's monsters represent external, supernatural threats rather than psychological projections. The Shadow and its servants operate independently of Daniel's psychology, creating fear through pursuit and helplessness rather than psychological recognition and integration. Dead Space, body horror versus mind horror. Dead Space excels at visceral body horror through necromorph design and dismemberment mechanics, but its psychological elements remain secondary to action and resource management. Isaac Clarke's hallucinations of Nicole represent grief and guilt, but lack the sophisticated symbolic framework that makes Silent Hill's psychological manifestations therapeutically meaningful. The marker's influence creates mass psychosis and religious delusion, exploring collective psychological breakdown rather than individual trauma processing. While thematically interesting, this approach lacks the personal investment and individual psychological journey that defines Silent Hill's approach. Dead Space 2's exploration of Isaac's PTSD shows influence from Silent Hill's psychological horror approach, but the implementation remains surface level compared to James Sunderland's complex guilt manifestation and symbolic monster design. Soma, existential versus personal horror. Soma presents sophisticated philosophical horror examining consciousness, identity, and artificial intelligence, but its existential themes operate differently from Silent Hill's personal psychological focus. The game raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness and continuity of identity, but these remain intellectual rather than emotionally personal. Simon's identity crisis stems from technological circumstances rather than psychological trauma. While disturbing and thought-provoking, his situation lacks the emotional weight and personal responsibility that drive Silent Hill's psychological horror. Players confront philosophical problems rather than personal psychological material. The WAU and its experiments represent external threats to human consciousness rather than internal psychological conflicts made manifest. The horror emerges from existential uncertainty rather than psychological recognition and integration. Outlast, shock horror versus psychological depth. Outlast relies heavily on jump scares, gore, and extreme violence to create immediate fear responses, representing the opposite extreme from Silent Hill's psychological subtlety. The Mount Massive asylum setting and its deranged inmates create horror through external threat and shock value rather than internal psychological exploration. Miles Upshur remains psychologically stable throughout his ordeal, functioning as passive observer of external horror rather than active participant in psychological journey. His camera mechanic creates voyeuristic distance from the horror rather than personal investment in psychological outcomes. The game's approach to mental illness through the asylum setting often relies on harmful stereotypes rather than Silent Hill's clinically informed portrayals. Mental illness becomes a source of external threat rather than internal struggle requiring understanding and integration. PT and the cancelled Silent Hills, Kojima's interpretation. PT playable teaser for the cancelled Silent Hills demonstrated how other developers interpret Silent Hill's psychological approach. Hideo Kojima and Guillermo del Toro's collaboration showed sophisticated understanding of Silent Hill's core principles while adding unique elements. The looping hallway concept created psychological claustrophobia through repetition and subtle environmental changes, reflecting how trauma survivors experience recurring thoughts and memories. Each loop revealed new psychological information while maintaining the familiar framework, demonstrating how traumatic memories can be simultaneously repetitive and evolving. Lisa's appearances followed psychological rather than logical patterns, manifesting based on the player's attention and behavior rather than scripted sequences. This approach respected Silent Hill's tradition of making supernatural manifestations dependent on psychological state rather than external triggers. The radio broadcasts and environmental storytelling revealed domestic violence and family trauma themes, continuing Silent Hill's exploration of how intimate relationships can become sources of psychological horror. The father's violence against Lisa and their unborn child reflected real-world trauma patterns rather than fantastical supernatural threats. Contemporary horror games and Silent Hill's influence. Modern horror games increasingly show Silent Hill's influence through psychological complexity and symbolic monster design. Games like Layers of Fear explore artists' psychological breakdown through environmental storytelling, while The Evil Within incorporates surreal psychological landscapes reminiscent of Silent Hill's approach. Visage explicitly homages PT and Silent Hill's psychological horror through domestic trauma exploration and symbolic environmental storytelling. The game's multiple family tragedies create psychological weight through personal rather than abstract horror. Little Nightmares creates childhood nightmare imagery that echoes Silent Hill's symbolic approach, though with less clinical psychological depth. The game's grotesque adults and threatening environments reflect child psychology and developmental fears. Why Silent Hill's approach remains unique. Silent Hill's psychological sophistication stems from its integration of legitimate psychological theory with interactive design. While other horror games may incorporate psychological elements, few demonstrate the clinical accuracy and therapeutic depth that characterizes Team Silent's work. The series' requirement for player psychological recognition creates investment that transcends entertainment. Players don't simply observe psychological horror. They participate in psychological processes that mirror therapeutic work. This active engagement with psychological material creates lasting impact beyond immediate fear responses. Silent Hill's symbolic consistency across multiple games creates a coherent psychological language that other franchises lack. The recurring themes, symbols, and psychological frameworks create depth and meaning that accumulates across the series, rewarding psychological literacy and emotional investment. Most importantly, Silent Hill respects both psychology as a discipline and mental illness as a human experience. While other games may exploit mental illness for shock value or use psychological concepts superficially, Silent Hill demonstrates genuine understanding of psychological principles and their therapeutic applications. Cultural impact and mental health awareness. Silent Hill's influence extends beyond gaming into broader cultural conversations about mental health. The series arrived during a period of increasing mental health awareness, contributing to public understanding of psychological trauma and treatment. Its sophisticated portrayal of mental illness helped legitimize video games as a medium capable of addressing serious psychological themes. The franchise's impact on horror media extends to film, literature, and other interactive media. The Silent Hill film adaptations, while varying in quality, introduced the series' psychological concepts to broader audiences. Contemporary horror media increasingly incorporates Silent Hill's symbolic approach and psychological depth. Gaming industry influence. Silent Hill's success demonstrated market viability for psychologically sophisticated horror games, encouraging other developers to explore deeper psychological themes. The series proved that audiences would engage with complex, emotionally challenging content when presented through interactive media. The game's influence on independent horror developers has been particularly significant. Many contemporary indie horror games draw explicitly from Silent Hill's psychological approach, creating works that explore trauma, mental illness, and psychological healing through interactive experience. Silent Hill's integration of psychological theory with game design established precedent for consulting mental health professionals during development. Modern game studios increasingly recognize the importance of accurate mental health portrayal and therapeutic sensitivity in their work. Legacy and continuing influence. Silent Hill's psychological sophistication extends beyond entertainment into potential therapeutic applications. The series demonstrates how interactive media can foster empathy for mental illness sufferers, provide cathartic experiences for players with mental health struggles, and offer educational value for understanding psychological trauma. However, the series also illustrates ongoing challenges in responsible mental health portrayal. Horror contexts may reinforce fears about mental illness, while some entries wrongly associate mental illness with violence. Contemporary gaming movements have specifically used Silent Hill as both positive and negative example for mental health representation. The series' academic recognition continues growing, with researchers exploring games' potential as virtual reality therapy applications, empathy training tools, and public education resources about mental health conditions. Modern game developers increasingly consult mental health professionals, with new Silent Hill entries promising more responsible portrayals. Silent Hill's legacy lies in proving video games can serve as legitimate vehicles for exploring complex psychological themes, establishing precedent for psychologically informed game design that continues influencing contemporary developers. The series demonstrates that interactive horror can transcend simple entertainment to become genuine exploration of human psychological experience, creating space for both catharsis and education within popular culture. Through masterful integration of established psychological theory with innovative interactive design, Team Silent created experiences that function as extended psychoanalytic processes for both characters and players, establishing Silent Hill as not merely gaming's greatest psychological horror franchise, but as a landmark achievement in psychology's intersection with interactive media. The series proves that video games, when designed with psychological sophistication and clinical accuracy, can serve as powerful tools for understanding trauma, healing, and the complex workings of the human mind.